Hey there, this is Michel, and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, one of my longer ones, is number 23, the tragic Battle of Quebec. It's a bit longer than the others, as it's a critical time in Canada's history, so it's important to know this. And I call it tragic because this particular event in our history really hits home for me. I'm a very proud French Canadian. If you watched episode 12, My Ancestry, you'd have seen that my ancestors came to New France with Samuel de Champlain in 1608 and were some of the very first settlers here. I won't repeat episode 12, but I'd like to say that the very first habitants or settlers of Quebec are registered as Louis Hébert, his wife Marie Rolette, and their 3 children. These settlers came to the colony on the same ship with Samuel de Champlain in 1608 and are my 9 times great-grandparents. And the Battle of the Plains of Abraham happened on the farmland of my 10 times great-grandfather, Abraham Martin, who came to the colony of Quebec in 1617. Okay, there are many more early habitants that are my ancestors, and were there during these times, but that's enough about me. Let's move on. Now, before we start, let's take a quick moment to review what we saw and heard in the last episode. We learned that the conquest of New France started with a small skirmish in the Ohio Valley, and in 1755, British Americans captured Fort Beauséjour in Acadia, opening the door for the deportation of the Acadians. We also learned that the British finally captured the fortress of Louisbourg in 1758, and we were introduced to Montcalm and Wolfe, both who would figure prominently in the coming battle for Quebec. Okay, now we're ready to start this episode on the Battle for Quebec, the last episode on the conquest of New France. In 1759, the odds were against New France. The British had 3 ships to France's 1. The British had 4 regular troops to New France's 1. And the British were ahead 10-1 in money. Unfortunately for New France, they were outgunned, outmanned, and outplayed. But France didn't need to beat the British. They just had to wear them down, make the war last long enough so that the British would find it too expensive to continue. But was that even possible with what was coming up the St. Lawrence River? From Quebec's lower town and upper town, and from homes and farms, the habitants of Quebec City watched in fear as the British Armada arrived. More than 140 British ships stretched for 80 kilometers down the St. Lawrence River. With them, British General James Wolfe was in charge of an invasion fleet of 13,500 men and a strike force of 9,000 soldiers from the best units in the British military. And they dropped anchor just east of Quebec City. Quebec City was in a tough geographical location. It sat perched atop tall cliffs. The French General Montcalm, as we learned, was very conservative in his fighting techniques, so he did not come out to meet the British. He played a defensive game. A strategic mistake made by the French at the time was not to defend the south shore across from the river from Quebec City, now the city of Lévis. French engineers had convinced Montcalm that the British cannons could not reach Quebec City from that location. They told him not to waste soldiers defending it. They were wrong. The British captured the heights across the river from Quebec City, and on June 12, 1759, the bombardment of Quebec started. Cannons were able to reach across the river, over the lower town, and reach into the upper town. Quebec burned with day and night bombardments. Civilians died, and hundreds of homes were destroyed. There was no military purpose to this other than to terrorize the population. It was the Summer of Terror. French General Montcalm was forced to play along with British General Wolfe. When Wolfe moved, Montcalm countered. When Wolfe attacked, Montcalm responded. But British General Wolfe was becoming frustrated with Montcalm and Quebec City, so Wolfe gave the orders to burn and lay waste to the country to his American Rangers. The American Rangers were similar to the French Coureurs de Bois, just a little bit meaner. They burned homes, took scalps, and slaughtered livestock of the French habitants living along the St. Lawrence River. On the South Shore alone, the American Rangers destroyed more than 1,000 homes and destroyed any harvest. Now summer was turning to autumn, and British General Wolfe was running out of time. He would make one last attempt at taking Quebec City before winter came. Earlier, Wolfe had noticed a small break in the cliffs just west of Quebec City at a cove called Les Aux Foulons. This would be perfect if he could get his men landed, scale the cliff, and come out on top of the plains behind Quebec City. In mid-September, in the dark, he did just that. Wolfe sent 30 flat-bottomed boats upriver on the tide, almost unseen by the French. A French sentry did spot them, but the British successfully bluffed their way past and landed in a cove. An advance group scaled the cliff and overpowered the French post at the top. The rest of the British were now free to scale the cliff and land on the plains of Abraham. It was September 13th, 1759. By daybreak, British General Wolfe had positioned 4,500 troops on the plains of Abraham, unseen by the French. French General Montcalm was convinced that any attack by the British would come from the other side of the city, at Beauport Shore. Now, as Montcalm saw all the redcoats on the plains of Abraham, he had to quickly try to assemble his troops. Montcalm decided that he had to attack immediately before Wolfe could dig in. Montcalm did have some 3,000 reinforcements behind Wolfe, so he sent a message to them for them to advance immediately. But Montcalm didn't wait for them to arrive and decided to attack immediately. Another strategic mistake. Well, the battle lasted all of 15 minutes. British General Wolfe had set up his men in 2 red lines and waited while the French charged. Wolfe stood his ground, and as his soldiers were being picked off by the French. And when the French were about 30 paces away, Wolfe gave the order to fire. British platoon after platoon opened fire, reloaded, and advanced. The French broke and ran. French General Montcalm was shot in the stomach and rode back behind the walls of Quebec. He died there. British General Wolfe was also wounded and died on the battlefield. Both sides lost about 650 men, but the battle did not truly resolve anything. The British had won the field, as they say, but they were in a dangerously exposed position. It's important to note that Quebec City fell, not because the British won, but because the French had lost their nerve. Having lost the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, French Governor Vaudreuil panicked and fled Quebec City with his troops. 5 days later, the remaining city commander surrendered. And again, the Canadians hadn't been conquered by the British. They had been abandoned by France. As he fled towards Montreal, Governor Vaudreuil met the Chevalier de Lévis, the reinforcements. Lévis denounced them as cowards. When Lévis did arrive at Quebec City, he saw that it was already captured and under control of a Scotsman named James Murray. Lévis returned to Montreal. Lévis made his way back to Quebec City in the spring, in April, intent on taking the city back. Oddly enough, James Murray made the same mistake that Montcalm made. He rushed out to meet Lévis and ran right into a trap. The ensuing Battle of Sainte-Foy, sometimes called the Second Battle of the Plains of Abraham, was an impressive victory for the French. The British fled back to the fort of Quebec, leaving their artillery on the field of battle. Lévis set up camp and waited for reinforcements from France, but none came. What Lévis didn't know was that the British had defeated the French Navy in Europe, and the ships that did arrive at Quebec were British. Lévis returned to Montreal. Now, only Montreal was left in French hands. Quebec City had fallen, as did the fortress of Louisbourg, and the French fleet of 6 war vessels that were coming from France met a British blockade just 1 day out from France. Only 3 ships made it through and found that the St. Lawrence River too was blockaded. The 3 French ships fell back, taking refuge in the Bay of Chalard at the mouth of the Restigouche River in what is now northern New Brunswick. They sent a message across enemy lines to Montreal asking for orders. The British found out and sent their own fleet out of Louisbourg. They attacked on June 22, 1760. The Battle of Restigouche lasted 2 weeks, with the British winning. Now the British turned their sights towards Montreal. The British advanced from 3 sides: east from Quebec City, west from the Great Lakes, and south along the Lake Champlain waterways. Levy barely had 2,000 men compared to British Admiral Amherst's force of 17,000. The French had no options. They laid down their arms, burnt their regimental banners, and surrendered. The French word for their allies hoped to save the First Nations allies. In the terms of capitulation, a particular partial protection was included. Quote, Indian allies of the French king shall be maintained in the lands they inhabit if they choose to remain there. End quote. It was September 8th, 1760. New France had fallen. Well, that's it for the tragic history of the conquest of New France, Part 2. The event that would lead to the building of Canada as we know it today. In summary, we learned that New France was outgunned, outmanned, and outplayed. That 140 British ships stretched for 80 kilometers down the St. Lawrence River. That British General James Wolfe had an invasion fleet of 13,500 men and a strike force of 9,000 soldiers. We learned that the French made a few strategic mistakes, and that Wolfe was able to sneak troops up the cliffs and scale them up to the Plains of Abraham, coming up behind the city of Quebec on September 13, 1759. We also learned that both French General Montcalm and British General Wolfe died during the battle, and that 5 days later, the remaining city commanders surrendered. We saw that the French Navy was defeated in Europe by the British and could send little help. 3 ships did arrive, but were defeated at the Battle of Restigouche, and that Montreal surrendered on September 8, 1760, against a massive British presence. New France had indeed fallen. Now, please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 24, where we jump into the 1763 Treaty of Paris, where France signs over and cedes an empire. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.